You would not survive a single day in medieval times. Close your eyes and imagine you wake up tomorrow not in your warm bed, but on a thin sack of straw in a one-room hovel in the year 1300. It's freezing. It's pitch dark. And before the sun is even up, your body is already failing. The water you'd reach for to drink could kill you. The food on the table would horrify a modern stomach. A simple scratch could rot your arm off. A toothache could end your life. There are no painkillers, no antibiotics, no hospitals, no police you'd recognize, and no second chances. You, a modern human, soft from clean water, central heating and supermarkets would be dead before nightfall. Maybe within hours. This isn't an exaggeration. It's the brutal arithmetic of medieval survival. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how many invisible ways the Middle Ages would have ended you. Let's uncover the dark truth. The water would poison you. Let's start the moment you wake up thirsty, because that first instinct could be your last mistake. You stumble to find a drink. In your modern life, you turn a tap and clean water flows out, purified and tested. In medieval times, that concept simply didn't exist. Water came from rivers, wells, and streams, the very same rivers where waste was dumped, where animals waded, and where tanneries and butchers poured their filth. Drink from the wrong source, and you'd be swallowing the bacteria that caused dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. To a medieval body raised on this environment, there was at least some hardened tolerance. To you, with your sheltered modern gut, contaminated water would be a fast track to violent, dehydrating illness. Now here's a fact people love to repeat, that medieval people drank ale instead of water because water was unsafe. The truth is more nuanced. They did drink plenty of weak, low-alcohol, small beer, partly because the brewing process, which involved boiling, made it safer, and partly because it was nourishing and calorific. But they absolutely drank water too, when it came from a source they trusted, like a clean spring or well. The problem for you isn't choosing the drink, it's that you have no idea which sources are deadly and which are safe. You can't see bacteria, you have no way to test it. One careless gulp from the wrong stream, and dysentery, the disease they grimly nicknamed the flux, would have you bedridden and dangerously dehydrated within a day. And that's before you've even eaten breakfast. The food would wreck your modern body, assuming you survive your morning drink. Your next challenge is eating, and your pampered modern body is in for a shock. Forget variety. Forget freshness on demand. A medieval peasant's diet revolved around coarse, dark bread, pottage, a thick vegetable and grain stew, simmered endlessly in the same pot. Whatever vegetables were in season, and on lucky days, a little salted meat, cheese, or fish. There were no refrigerators, so meat was preserved by heavy salting or smoking, and fresh often meant not yet visibly rotten. Here's a detail that surprises people. Peasants doing backbreaking farm labor needed enormous amounts of energy. Some estimates suggest 3,000 to even 4,000 calories a day just to fuel their relentless physical work. They weren't starving by choice. They ate huge quantities of bread and grain to survive. The issue was that the food was monotonous, often low in certain nutrients, and entirely dependent on the harvest. And then there's the truly terrifying part. Bad grain could literally drive you insane. When rye became infected with a fungus called ergot, eating bread made from it caused ergotism, a horrifying condition that brought burning sensations, convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrene so severe that fingers and toes blackened and fell off. Entire villages were struck by these outbreaks, and people had no idea why. For you, the bigger killer might be the everyday germs. With no understanding of food safety, no refrigeration, and hands washed in dirty water, food poisoning was a constant lurking threat. Your modern immune system, unprepared for this onslaught, would be fighting a war it had never trained for. And you've still got the rest of the day to survive. A tiny cut could end you. Now let's say you go about your day's work, and here's where survival gets genuinely frightening. You're chopping wood, mending a fence, or working a field. Your hand slips. A splinter, a scrape, a small gash. In your world, you'd rinse it, dab on some antiseptic, slap a bandage over it, and forget about it by lunch. In the medieval world, That tiny cut could be a death sentence. There were no antibiotics, none. They wouldn't be discovered until the 20th century. So when bacteria entered that wound and in a world of dirt, manure, and unwashed everything, they always did, there was nothing to stop the infection from taking hold. The redness would spread. The skin would swell and heat. Without treatment, that local infection could turn into sepsis, where the bacteria flood your bloodstream and your organs begin to shut down. Imagine watching a red streak crawl up your arm from a wound on your hand, knowing that no medicine on earth can save you, that all anyone can offer is herbs, prayer, and perhaps the horror of amputation with an unsterilized blade. This is the reality that's almost impossible for modern minds to grasp. We live behind an invisible shield of antibiotics and antiseptics, and we've forgotten what life was like without it. Before that shield existed, a rusty nail, an animal bite, an infected tooth, or a minor battlefield wound could and routinely did kill. Soft, modern, antibiotic-dependent you, with no immunity and no medicine, would be terrifyingly fragile in a world where the smallest injury could quietly turn fatal. Disease would hunt you from every direction. But even if you avoid injury, the air itself feels like it's conspiring against you because medieval life was a gauntlet of disease. Picture the sheer variety of killers stalking the population. Dysentery and typhoid from filthy water. Tuberculosis, which they called consumption, slowly wasting people away as they coughed up blood. Smallpox scarring and blinding survivors. Influenza sweeping through in waves. Leprosy, so feared that sufferers were cast out of society entirely, forced to ring a bell to warn others of their approach. And looming above them all, the Black Death, the bubonic plague that tore through Europe beginning in 1347 and killed somewhere between a third and half of the entire continent in just a few short years. It spread through the bites of fleas carried on rats, swelling the lymph nodes into agonizing black lumps and killing most victims within days. People watched whole families, whole villages, vanish, and they had no idea what was causing it or how to stop it. Here's what makes this so lethal for you specifically. Your immune system has never met most of these diseases. You've been vaccinated against some, and you've lived your whole life in a sanitized world, dropped into the medieval soup of pathogens. With no prior exposure and no modern medicine, you'd be exquisitely vulnerable, a fresh, defenseless target. The diseases that medieval people had at least partially adapted to over generations would hit your unprepared body like a sledgehammer. And if disease didn't get you, the people around you very well might. Violence was a part of everyday life. Let's step out into the medieval street. Because the danger wasn't only microscopic, sometimes it carried a knife. Studies of medieval cities paint a startling picture. Researchers who mapped homicides in 14th century English cities like London, York, and Oxford found that lethal violence was far more common than in any modern Western city, clustered in dangerous hotspots where brawls erupted and blades came out fast. Most men carried a knife as an everyday tool. Tempers ran hot, alcohol flowed freely, and a tavern argument could escalate into a killing in seconds. Justice, meanwhile, was nothing you'd recognize. There was no organized police force patrolling to protect you. Communities relied on systems where neighbors were expected to raise a hue and cry and chase down criminals themselves. If you were accused of a crime, you might face trial by ordeal or brutal public punishments designed to terrify onlookers. The stocks, flogging, mutilation, or execution for crimes that today would draw a fine. Imagine being a stranger, which is exactly what you'd be. No family network, no reputation, no allies. In a tight-knit medieval community, outsiders were viewed with deep suspicion. You'd have no one to vouch for you, no one obligated to protect you, and no understanding of the unwritten social rules that kept people alive. A wrong word, an accusation, a misunderstanding over property or honor, and you could find yourself facing a mob or a magistrate with no idea how to defend yourself. And we haven't even talked about what happens to half the population every time they try to bring new life into this world. Childbirth was a brush with death. This chapter is one of the most sobering, so let's give it the weight it deserves. In medieval times, creating life routinely cost a life. For a woman, Every single pregnancy was a roll of the dice with death. There were no sterile delivery rooms, no surgeons trained in safe cesarean sections that the mother could survive, no way to stop a serious hemorrhage, and no antibiotics to fight the infections that so often followed birth. Childbirth was handled by midwives who relied on experience and tradition, doing their best in a world with no understanding of germs. Historians estimate that each birth carried a risk of death of roughly 1%, and since women often gave birth many times over their lives, the cumulative danger was severe, with perhaps 1 in 20 women dying as a result of childbirth. If the baby was positioned wrong, if the labor stalled, if bleeding wouldn't stop, there was often nothing anyone could do but watch and pray. And the danger didn't end with the mother. Infants died at staggering rates. Roughly a third of all children died before reaching the age of 5, carried off by infections, fevers, and diseases that today are easily prevented or cured. Mothers lived with the heartbreaking expectation that they would likely bury at least one of their children. This is the grim engine behind those famously low life expectancy numbers. Medieval life expectancy is often quoted as around 30 to 35 years. But that figure is dragged down dramatically by all those infant and child deaths. If you survived childhood, you could actually expect to reach your 50s or 60s. The real horror wasn't that everyone died young. It was that surviving long enough to grow up was the hardest part of all. The cold and the dark would break you. Now imagine the sun going down on your single medieval day and discovering that night itself was an enemy. In your modern life, darkness is banished with the flick of a switch, and cold is defeated by a thermostat. Strip all of that away. When the sun set in the Middle Ages, true darkness fell, a blackness so complete it's almost unknown to people today. Candles were expensive, and even a fire gave only a flickering, smoky glow. Your world shrank to the small circle of light you could afford, and beyond it lay total dark. The cold was relentless and dangerous. A peasant home was often a drafty single room with a dirt floor, shared with the household and sometimes the animals for shared warmth. Heating meant a single open fire, which filled the room with eye-stinging smoke since proper chimneys were a luxury. Winter wasn't an inconvenience, it was a deadly season. The very old and the very young routinely died from the cold and from the illnesses that thrived in it. Picture you, accustomed to climate control and instant light, trying to endure a freezing medieval night. No heating you'd recognize, damp clothes that never fully dried. A smoky, dim room. Lice in the bedding. The constant low-grade misery of being cold, itchy, and never quite comfortable. And here's the exhausting truth. There was no real rest from it. Survival was relentless physical labor from before dawn until after dark, day after day, season after season, with no weekends, no vacations, and no escape. Which brings us to the final reason you simply wouldn't make it. You have none of the skills you'd need. Here is the most overlooked reason of all, and it might be the one that finishes you fastest. You don't actually know how to do anything that matters in medieval times. Think honestly about it. Could you grow your own food from raw soil, reading the weather and the seasons with no forecast? Could you preserve meat for winter without a fridge, judging the salt by feel? Could you identify which wild plants are food and which are poison? Could you spin wool, weave cloth, and sew the only clothes you'll ever own? Could you start a fire without a match, butcher an animal, brew safe ale, or build and repair a shelter with your bare hands? A medieval peasant could do nearly all of this by the time they were a teenager. These weren't hobbies. They were the basic, hard-won skills that stood between a person and death. Knowledge was passed down through families over generations, and survival depended on it utterly. You, by contrast, have spent your life mastering things that are completely worthless in 1300. Your smartphone is a dead, useless brick. Your job doesn't exist. Your money is the wrong shape and metal. Everything you know about navigating the world, apps, electricity, written instructions, customer service vanishes the moment you arrive. Imagine the helplessness. Cold, hungry, sick, and surrounded by people who can do 100 essential things you can't. in a language and dialect you might barely understand, with no documents proving who you are. You wouldn't just be a tourist out of your depth. You'd be a liability, and in a world with no safety net, being unable to contribute was its own quiet sentence. So when you put it all together, the conclusion is impossible to escape. The final truth. So let's be honest about what we've uncovered. You would not survive a single day in medieval times. And not because medieval people were superhuman, but because you are profoundly, wonderfully soft, shaped entirely by a world they could never have dreamed of. The water would poison you. The food would shock your body and could even drive you mad. A tiny cut could rot you alive. A dozen diseases your immune system has never met would hunt you. Violence simmered in the streets with no police to call. Childbirth was a brush with death. A third of children never grew up, and the cold and dark of night were genuine killers. And through it all, you'd lack every single survival skill that medieval people learned as children. But here's the part worth sitting with. Medieval people weren't weak or stupid. They were astonishingly tough, resourceful, and resilient, forged by a world that punished the smallest mistake. They survived what would destroy USA. In a strange way, this isn't a story about how primitive the past was. It's a humbling reminder of just how fragile our comfort has made us. And how extraordinary it is to live in an age of clean water, medicine, and warmth. If this journey into the brutal reality of medieval survival gripped you, hit subscribe and ring the bell. More dark secrets are waiting to be unlocked. Tell us in the comments, how long do you honestly think you'd last? And until next time, never forget the past was far harsher than they ever taught you in school.